The album was open before I even set the casserole dish down, and the first thing I saw was my son's face in a charcoal suit, standing next to a woman I had never laid eyes on in my life. For a second, I thought my mind was playing tricks. I blinked, leaned closer, and the picture didn't change. Mark. My Mark. Standing in front of what looked like a stone archway wrapped in white flowers, his hand resting on the small of a stranger's back like he'd done it 100 times before. She was beautiful, poised, her smile aimed at the camera the way people smile when they've practiced it in a mirror. I had never seen that smile before. I had never heard her name. My chest went tight before my brain caught up to what my eyes already understood. I have spent 31 years learning how to hold my face still when something threatens to break it open, and I put that training to work right there in Tanisha Colvin's cluttered little office, standing over her desk with a Pyrex dish still warm in my hands. My name is Clemmy Broughton. I built a construction company out of one flatbed truck and a prayer, raised my son mostly on my own, and learned a long time ago that the loudest reaction in the room is rarely the smartest one. Tanisha, I said, and I heard my own voice come out smaller than I meant it to. Isn't this Mark? She looked up from whatever invoice she'd been drowning in, and something crossed her face that I'd known her long enough to recognize. The look of a woman who's just realized the floor she's standing on isn't as solid as she thought. It was, she started, then stopped, cleared her throat like the words were caught somewhere behind it. It was 2 weeks ago. He wanted to keep it private. Only... She paused again, and I watched her decide whether to finish the sentence or swallow it. Only important people. 2 weeks. My son had been married for 2 weeks, and I found out standing in a stranger's office over a photo album that wasn't even meant for my eyes. If you're watching this right now, I'd love to know what time it is for you. Morning coffee? Or winding down at night? Type it below. It helps me know who's sitting with me through this. I smiled. I want you to understand that the smile was real in its own strange way. Not warmth, but the kind of smile a woman wears when her mind has already moved 3 steps ahead of her heart, doing quiet math nobody in the room can see. Tanisha kept talking. Something about the flowers, the venue, how lovely everything had turned out. Words tumbling out of her like she could fill the silence before it swallowed us both. I nodded at the right places. I told her the arrangements were beautiful. I picked my dish back up off her desk like I'd only come to drop off a casserole and nothing more. And then I walked out of that office with my spine straight and my hands steady. I didn't cry in the parking lot. I sat in my car with the engine off, hands on the wheel. And I found myself doing something I didn't expect, not grieving, not raging, but counting. Somewhere behind my ribs, a list had already started forming, quiet and precise. And it had nothing to do with flowers or invitations, or a woman whose name I still didn't know. It had everything to do with paperwork, sitting in a fireproof box in my closet, paperwork with my signature on it, paperwork I built a company out of 31 years ago, and had never once had a reason to look at twice. I started my car, and for the first time since I'd walked through Tanisha's door, I knew exactly where I needed to go next. The closet in my bedroom has a false bottom I built myself. Back when Mark was still small enough to think I was just being nosy about his report cards. I knelt down in front of it that night, still in the same blouse I'd worn to Tanisha's office, and I pulled out the fireproof box like I'd done maybe 3 times in 9 years. The lock stuck the way it always did. I had to jiggle it twice before it gave. The first thing on top was the loan application from 1994. My signature shakier back then than it is now. The ink a little faded, where my hand had rested too long, deciding whether to sign it. I remember sitting at my mother's kitchen table with that pen in my hand, 26 years old, staring at a number that terrified me, putting my name and my mother's house, since it was still hers then, on the line for a flatbed truck and a dream nobody else believed in. Underneath that was a photograph, curled at the edges, of that same truck parked crooked in a gravel lot. Me standing next to it in work boots, 2 sizes too big, because I couldn't afford the right ones yet. I didn't cry looking at it. I just sat there and let my hand rest flat against the photograph for a moment, the way you'd touch someone's shoulder to steady them. Underneath the old photographs sat the paperwork that actually mattered now. The operating agreement, drawn up a decade ago when the company had grown into something real. Something with 4 crews and a name people in Nashville recognized. I remembered the day I signed Mark's 24-year-old name into that agreement, giving him 40% of everything I'd built, watching his face when I told him. He'd turned down an offer from an architecture firm downtown to stay and run the company with me, and I wanted him to have something real to show for that choice. Not just a paycheck, but ownership, a stake, a future he could point to and call his own. I kept 60%. Not because I doubted him, because some habits, once you've clawed your way up from nothing, don't leave you, even when you love somebody enough to hand them the world. Next to the operating agreement sat the personal guarantee on the business line of credit at First Horizon. My name, my credit, my signature. Standing behind every dollar the company had ever borrowed to make payroll through a slow winter. And beneath that, the deed to the equipment yard, 6 acres out past the interstate, leased to the company at a rate I hadn't raised since the year gas prices spiked, and I didn't have the heart to squeeze him during a hard season. I sat back on my heels and looked at all of it spread across my bedroom floor. 3 decades of my life laid out in paper. Every page a decision I'd made out of love, never once imagining I'd need to understand what any of it actually meant in a fight. Because that's what this was now. Whether Mark understood it yet or not, whether Deja's father understood it or not, this was a fight. And I intended to know exactly what weapons I was standing on. I picked up my phone and called Faye Whitlow before I could talk myself into waiting until morning. "Faye," I said, when she picked up on the second ring, "I need you to tell me something, and I need you to tell me straight. If I own 60% of that company, what does that actually give me the right to do?" There was a pause on the other end, just long enough that I knew her answer wasn't going to be simple. "Clemmy," she said slowly, "it might give you more control than you're ready for." She was standing on my porch before I'd even decided what I was going to do with everything I'd found the night before, and something about seeing her there in person, uninvited, told me she already knew more than she was going to say. I recognized her instantly from the album. Up close, she looked younger than her photographs, less composed. Her hands wrapped tight around the strap of her purse, like it was the only thing keeping her steady. I didn't invite her in right away. I stood in my own doorway and looked at her the way I'd look at a stranger walking onto one of my job sites without a hard hat. "Mrs. Broughton," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the second word. "I'm Deja. I know this isn't how. I know I should have come sooner." I stepped back and let her into my living room, mostly because I wanted to see what she'd say once she was sitting across from me with nowhere left to hide behind. She sat on the edge of my couch like she might need to leave quickly, hands still gripping that purse strap. "Mark doesn't know I'm here," she said. "I needed to come myself." I didn't say anything. I've learned that silence pulls more truth out of a person than any question ever could. "The wedding being small, being private," she started, then stopped, chose her next words the way you'd step carefully across ice. That wasn't really Mark's idea. My father had a lot of opinions about how things should be handled. She paused again, and I watched her decide, right there in front of me, how much of the sentence she was actually willing to finish. He has strong opinions about a lot of things, especially business. Especially my business, I said. It wasn't a question, and she didn't treat it like one. Her eyes dropped to her hands for just a second too long. He's involved in a lot of things. Around town, banking mostly. He has ideas about how Priest and Sons could grow, how it could be run differently going forward. Run differently. I let that phrase sit in the room between us without touching it, because I wanted to see if she'd flinch first. She did. I don't fully know all the details, she added quickly, and I could hear in her own voice that she didn't fully believe what she'd just said either. You should have told me sooner, I said, and I kept my voice even. No heat in it, just fact. Not about the wedding. About all of it. I'd have listened to a real conversation, Deja. I've had those my whole life. What I won't sit still for is finding out my own son got married through a photo album on somebody else's desk. She flinched at that, a small tightening around her eyes, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. A young woman caught between a father with plans and a husband who didn't seem to be asking the right questions. Almost. What does your father do? Exactly, I asked. Plain, direct, no room to slide around it. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her hands tightened on the purse strap until her knuckles went pale, and the silence that followed lasted just a beat too long to be nothing. Faye's office smelled like fresh coffee and old paper, and she had the operating agreement open on her desk before I'd even finished sitting down, like she'd been waiting on me since the phone call 2 nights before. I read it twice last night, she said, sliding her glasses up her nose. Cover to cover. I want you to hear this from me plainly, Clemmy, before you get any ideas about moving fast. I'm not looking to move fast, I said. I'm looking to move right. She almost smiled at that, the way she does when I say something that makes her job easier. Good. Because there's a process here, and if we skip a single step, Mark's side could challenge the whole thing later and drag this out for years instead of weeks. I sat back in the chair across from her desk and let her talk, though every part of me wanted her to just tell me it was already done. Removing a managing member requires a formal vote at a properly called special meeting, she said. That much comes from state law as a baseline, but the specific notice period, the exact number of days you and Mark are both bound by, that comes straight from Article 9 of your own operating agreement, the one you and Mark signed together a decade ago. You wrote stricter terms into that contract than the state requires, probably without even realizing it at the time. How many days? I asked, already dreading the answer written on her face. 30, she said. 30 days from the date I send that notice to the date we can hold the vote. Not a day less. Or we hand him grounds to fight it before we've even finished the fight. And because it's written into your own agreement, a judge won't have much sympathy if we try to shortcut our own contract. 30 days. I sat with that number, felt it settle into my chest like a stone dropped into still water. That's a long time to let this sit, I said. It is, Faye agreed. No apology in her voice, just fact laid flat on the table between us. But Clemmy, listen to me. If we rush this and he finds one crack, a judge or an arbitrator, since your agreement requires any member dispute over a vote like this to go through binding arbitration rather than open court, could throw the whole thing out later. You built this company doing everything by the book. This is not the moment to stop. I thought about the loan application from 1994, the way I'd never once cut a corner because cutting corners was how people like me lost everything they'd built. Faye was right, and some tired, aching part of me hated that she was right. "Do it," I said. "Send the notice." She nodded once, pulled a fresh sheet of letterhead toward her, and started typing while I watched. I sat there and watched her draft it word by word, watched her check the date against a calendar taped to her wall, watched her circle a Friday 5 weeks out in red ink. "That's your date," she said, turning the calendar so I could see it. 30 days from today, to the letter. "Send it," I said again, quieter this time. Faye picked up the phone to call her assistant in for the mailing, and just like that, the clock had started. Friday came, the way every dreaded date eventually does, quietly, at 7 in the morning, with the sun cutting flat across my kitchen table where Faye had spread the paperwork the night before. I hadn't slept much, not from doubt, from the particular kind of stillness that settles into a person right before they do something that can't be undone. I dressed the way I would for a funeral. Dark blue blouse, low heels, hair pulled back neat, because some part of me understood that today deserved that kind of respect, even if nobody else in the room would think to call it that. Faye met me at her office at 9, 30 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. "He was noticed properly," she said, checking her file one more time out of habit rather than doubt. "Certified mail, signed for 30 days ago, right at the edge of the window. He knows this meeting is happening." "Will he come?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Faye glanced at the clock. "That's his choice to make." 9:30 came and went. So did 9:45. I sat across from Faye in a small conference room with a court reporter Faye had hired to keep an official record, and I watched the door the way you watch a door when part of you is still hoping, even after everything, that the person on the other side of it will choose differently than they have every other time. He didn't come. "We have quorum regardless," Faye said gently, watching my face rather than her paperwork for a moment. "Your 60% alone satisfies that requirement. We can proceed." I nodded, and something in my chest went very quiet. The way a room goes quiet right before somebody says something that changes it forever. Faye read the resolution aloud for the record, plain language, no dressing it up. A motion to remove Mark Broughton as managing member of Priest and Sons Construction, LLC, effective immediately upon vote, with all managing authority reverting to the majority member until further action by the membership. She looked up at me when she finished. "Clemmy Broughton, as holder of 60% membership interest." "How do you vote?" I thought, for just a breath, about a flatbed truck in a gravel lot, about work boots 2 sizes too big, about a 24-year-old boy turning down an architecture firm to build something with me instead. And then I thought about an album on a stranger's desk, and a stranger's smile, and the words, "Only important people." I said, clear, steady, no tremor in it at all. The court reporter's fingers moved across her keys, and just like that, on paper, in ink, under the full weight of the agreement I'd signed a decade ago. My son no longer had the authority to sign a single contract, approve a single payroll run, or bind that company to anything at all. Faye began preparing the formal letters, one to Mark, one to First Horizon Bank, updating signing authority on the company accounts, one for the state filing. She said she'd have them out by end of day. She never got the chance to mail the first one. My phone rang 2 days later, and it was Mark, his voice tight and confused before I'd even said hello. He told me his company card had been declined at a supply yard that morning, humiliating in front of 2 of his crew. And when he'd called the bank to sort it out, the account manager had gone quiet and careful on the phone, telling him only that there was a hold on his signing authority and that he'd need to come in personally to discuss it further. He hadn't come in yet. He'd called me first. He was at my front door before noon, still in his work boots, mud dried stiff along the cuffs of jeans I remembered buying him 3 Christmases ago. And I knew before he said a word that the bank had already told him more than Faye's letter ever would have. Mama. His voice cracked on the word, something between disbelief and accusation. What did you do? I stepped back and let him in, the same way I'd let Deja in days before, because I wasn't going to have this conversation shouted across a porch for the neighbors to hear. He followed me into the kitchen, pacing instead of sitting, running a hand over his head the way he'd done since he was 12 years old and cornered about something. I read my own paperwork, I said, keeping my voice level. Turns out, I own a good deal more of that company than anyone's bothered to remember in a long while. You voted me out, without even talking to me first. You were noticed properly, Mark. Certified mail, 30 days before the meeting. You chose not to show up. I let that sit a moment. That was your decision. Same as mine. He stopped pacing, planted both hands flat on my counter like he needed something solid to hold on to. This is about the wedding. This is you punishing me because you found out from Tanisha instead of from me. This is about 2 weeks, I said, and I didn't raise my voice, didn't need to. 2 weeks, Mark. You had a wife for 2 weeks before I even knew her name. Not because you forgot. Because somebody decided I wasn't important enough to tell. It wasn't like that. His jaw tightened. Deja's family wanted something small. Her father doesn't like a lot of noise around personal things, and I went along with it. It wasn't about you. Everything is about somebody, Mark. If it wasn't about me, it was about keeping me at a distance long enough for something else to happen first. I watched his face when I said it, watched for the flicker of recognition, and I found it, quick and gone, like a light switched on and off in a dark room. That's not... He started, then stopped himself, and the unfinished sentence told me more than anything he could have said out loud. I'd have listened, I said quietly. You know that. I've listened to you your whole life. What I won't accept is being managed like I'm a problem to be handled instead of your mother. So you handle me instead, he shot back, some heat finally cracking through. Strip my name off everything I've built the last 6 years and call it justice. I didn't strip your name off anything. You still own 40% of that company, same as the day I signed it over to you. What you don't have anymore is the authority to run it without me. Those are different things, and deep down, you know that. He didn't answer that. He just stood there in my kitchen, mud on his cuffs, jaw working like he wanted to argue further but couldn't find solid ground to stand on. Why didn't you tell me, Mark? I asked, soft now. The anger drained out of it, just the question underneath everything else. Not the business, the marriage. Why did you let 2 weeks go by? He looked at me for a long moment, and I watched something move behind his eyes. Guilt, maybe. Or the beginning of an answer he wasn't ready to give voice to yet. Then he turned, grabbed his keys off my counter, and walked out without saying another word. I hadn't spoken to Tanisha since the day I walked out of her office with a casserole dish and a wound I hadn't let her see. And 3 days after Mark stormed out of my kitchen, I finally picked up the phone and asked her to meet me for coffee, because 30 years of friendship deserved better than silence. She was already at the table when I got there, hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking from. And the moment she saw my face, she set it down like she'd been bracing for this conversation the whole drive over. Clemmy, I need you to know... Let me start, I said, and I sat down across from her, keeping my voice low but not soft. You've known me 30 years, Tanisha. You planned that wedding, start to finish, and you let 2 weeks pass without a single word to me. I need to understand why. She flinched, but she didn't look away. There's a confidentiality agreement, Clemmy. Every client signs one when they book with me. It's standard. It protects the couple, protects my business too. I don't get to decide who finds out what or when. Deja and Mark specifically requested I not discuss any details of the event with anyone outside the immediate party until they were ready to share it themselves. So, a piece of paper mattered more than 30 years of friendship. That piece of paper is the reason I have a business at all, she said. And there was steel in it now, not defensiveness. You think I liked sitting on that? You think I didn't think about calling you a dozen times? If word got out that I break confidentiality whenever it's inconvenient, I lose every client who trusts me with their family's business. I'd have lost everything I built the same way you built yours, brick by brick, promise by promise. I sat with that a moment, feeling the anger in my chest shift, not disappear, but settle into something more honest. I thought about my own signature on a personal guarantee, my own name standing behind promises I'd made to a bank, a crew, an entire company built on nothing but people trusting my word was good. Understood binding obligations. I'd built my whole life on them. I'm not asking you to choose me over your business, I said finally. I never was. I just needed to understand it wasn't nothing to you. It was never nothing, Tanisha said, her eyes wet now. Watching you find out like that, standing right there in my office, that's going to stay with me a long time, Clemmy. Longer than you know. We sat quiet a moment, the kind of quiet that repairs something instead of breaking it further, and I felt my shoulders loosen for the first time in days. For what it's worth, Tanisha said, wrapping both hands back around her cooling cup. I probably shouldn't say this, but I've been thinking about it since you left that day. Deja's father, Delano. He came by my office twice before the wedding, not for planning, asking questions about priest and sons, about how long you'd been running it, about whether Mark had real say in things yet. I went still. What kind of questions, Tanisha? She hesitated, setting her cup down slowly, like she was only now understanding the weight of what she'd overheard back then. The kind that made me wonder, even then, if that wedding had less to do with love than somebody wanted us all to believe. Mark came by again on a Tuesday evening. No mud on his boots this time, no fire in his voice either. Just a kind of tired uncertainty that sat strange on him. I let him in, poured 2 glasses of sweet tea out of habit more than hospitality, and we sat at my kitchen table like 2 people trying to remember how to talk to each other. Delano thinks he can fix this, Mark said finally, turning his glass in slow circles on the table without drinking from it. The bank part, anyway. Says he's got relationships at a couple of institutions downtown, people who'd structure something new for the company. Financing that wouldn't need your guarantee behind it at all. Something in my chest went cold and sharp at once. Fix it how? Exactly? He didn't give me all the details. Just said if the company had financing tied to my ownership stake instead of yours, it wouldn't matter as much whether you'd pulled your guarantee or not. Said it might even strengthen my position. He finally looked up at me. I told him I needed to think about it. But you're considering it, I said. Not a question. He didn't answer right away, and that silence told me everything his words hadn't. I don't know what else to do, Mama. I've got no authority right now. No say. If there's a way to keep the company steady without going through you for every decision, without going through me, I repeated quietly, is exactly the plan he's had since before your wedding, Mark. You just haven't wanted to see it. He didn't argue that. He finished his tea, thanked me for it in a voice that didn't sound thankful at all, and left with the same uneasy weight on his shoulders he'd walked in with. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was out at the equipment yard, and the name on the screen surprised me. Whitfield. the loan officer who'd handled my accounts at First Horizon since before Mark was born. A man who'd watched me sign that very first flatbed truck loan with my hand shaking. "Clemmy," he said, low and careful, the tone of a man choosing every word like it cost him something. "I probably shouldn't be calling you about this, but you've been a client of mine longer than most marriages last, and I figured you'd want to know somebody's been sniffing around your company's file. Not through your accounts directly, through a colleague of mine at another branch, asking about Priest and Sons' credit structure, ownership percentages, whether the business could qualify for financing that didn't run through your guarantee." "Did you get a name?" I asked, already certain of the answer before he gave it. "Not officially, but whoever it is has real connections, Clemmy. These aren't questions a stranger off the street gets answered. Somebody with standing opened those doors for him." I thanked him, told him I understood the risk he'd taken calling me at all, and sat down slowly on the tailgate of a truck once I'd hung up, thinking about a man I'd never once spoken to directly, quietly working phones and favors to unbuild something it had taken me 31 years to construct. I called Faye that same afternoon and told her everything Whitfield had shared. "Is it legal? What he's doing?" I asked her. "Technically, yes," Faye said. And I could hear the tightness in her voice, the particular frustration of a woman who understands exactly how much damage a person can do while staying inside every line. "He's not breaking any law asking questions or exploring financing options, but Clemmy, if he manages to arrange something that makes your guarantee irrelevant to that company's survival, it doesn't touch the vote we already won, but it strips away a piece of the leverage that's kept you protected this whole time." "Then I suppose it's time I finally met him myself," I said. The envelope came by courier on a Thursday afternoon. Thick cream paper with a downtown law firm's letterhead I didn't recognize, and I knew before I'd even broken the seal that whatever sat inside it hadn't been Mark's idea. I called Faye before I'd finished reading the second paragraph. "He's contesting the vote," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Formal notice. Some firm called Ashcombe and Reed. Says the removal was improperly noticed and demands the vote be voided." "Send it to me right now," Faye said, already sounding more irritated than worried. "Ashcombe and Reed. Clemmy, that's not a firm a construction foreman hires on his own dime. That's corporate counsel, the kind that bills in 5 figures before lunch." "Delano," I said. "I'd put money on it." Mark called that same evening, and for the first time since the vote, he sounded less angry than uncertain, like a man reading lines he hadn't fully agreed to say. "Mama, I need you to understand. This isn't about hurting you. Delano just thinks... He thinks the notice period might not have been handled right, and if it wasn't, I've got a right to challenge it. That's all this is." "Whose idea was the lawyer, Mark?" Silence stretched long enough to answer the question for him. "He set it up," Mark finally admitted, quiet now. "Said it wouldn't cost me anything. Said it was just protecting my interests. I didn't ask him to do it exactly, but I didn't tell him not to either." "That's the same thing, Mark. You know that." He didn't argue. He just said he hoped I understood and hung up before I could tell him understanding wasn't the problem. I drove to Faye's office first thing the next morning, and she was already at her desk with the certified mail receipts spread out in front of her, along with a printed timeline she'd built overnight, every date marked and cross-referenced against the operating agreement's requirements. "Talk to me straight," I said, sitting down across from her. "Is there anything in that vote he can actually use?" Faye leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since this whole fight began, I saw something flicker across her face that wasn't quite doubt, but wasn't full confidence either. "On paper, we followed every rule," she said. 30-day notice period, certified delivery, signed receipt. Quorum satisfied by your ownership alone. Resolution read into the record by a licensed court reporter. If everything I filed matches everything that actually happened in that room, This challenge doesn't have a leg to stand on. But, I said, hearing the word she hadn't spoken yet. But a challenge like this doesn't need much to cause real damage, Clemmy. If Ashcombe and Reed finds one date that doesn't line up, one detail in the minutes that contradicts the certified mail log, even something small, a judge could question the whole vote's validity. Not because the challenge is strong, because sloppy documentation gives sloppy judges an excuse to slow everything down for months while they sort it out. My stomach tightened at that. Is our documentation sloppy? I don't think so, Faye said, already reaching for the folder holding the original meeting minutes. But I'm not going to tell you it's clean until I've gone through every single line myself, word for word, date for date, and made absolutely certain there isn't one thing in there that contradicts anything we've already filed with the state. She pulled the folder open, spread the pages across her desk, and reached for a pen. Give me until tomorrow, she said. I need to read every word of this myself before I tell you we're safe. Faye called me at 6 the next morning, earlier than she'd ever called before, and I answered on the first ring because I hadn't really been sleeping anyway. Come in, she said. I've been through it twice already. I want you here for the third pass. I was dressed and out the door in 20 minutes, coffee untouched on my counter, my mind running through every date Faye had circled weeks ago like they were beads on a rosary I couldn't stop counting. Her office looked like a storm had passed through it. Folders open across every surface, sticky notes marking pages, a legal pad covered edge to edge in her small, precise handwriting. She looked up when I came in, and I couldn't read her face yet, which frightened me more than if she'd looked worried outright. Sit, she said. Let's do this together, out loud, so you hear it the same way I did. She started with the certified mail receipt, tracing her finger along the delivery confirmation. Notice, mailed, April 14th, signed for April 17th by Mark himself, his own signature right here. She slid it across the desk so I could see it. That's 30 days before the meeting, satisfying the window exactly, with the margin built in on purpose. I nodded, throat tight, and she moved to the next page. Meeting minutes, dated May 17th. Court reporter's certification attached. Quorum noted as satisfied by your 60% membership interest alone, consistent with the operating agreement's own language on majority control. She tapped the page. No ambiguity here, no room for interpretation. She kept going, page by page, cross-referencing every date against the state filing, every signature against the bank's updated records, every single detail I'd trusted her to get right laid bare on her desk for both of us to examine one more time. When she finally set the last page down, she exhaled, long and slow, the kind of breath that had clearly been held for longer than just that morning. Clemmy, she said, I've read this 6 times now, forward and backward. There isn't a gap, not one. Every notice, every signature, every date lines up exactly the way it should. If Ashcombe and Reed thinks they're going to find a crack in this, they're going to be disappointed. Something in my chest loosened for the first time in days, not triumph exactly, but the particular relief of a woman who built something with her own 2 hands and just watched it hold weight it was never tested against before. You did this, Faye said, looking at me directly. Not luck, not me covering for you. You insisted on doing every single step properly, even when it cost you time you didn't want to spend. That discipline is the reason this challenge doesn't have anywhere to go. I sat with that for a moment, feeling something steady settle into my spine that hadn't been there since the day I stood in Tanisha's office. So, it's over, I said. The challenge. Faye's expression shifted. Careful now, pulling me back from the relief before I could rest too fully inside it. The paperwork holds, Clemmy. I'd stake my license on that. But we haven't sat across from their attorney yet. Haven't had an arbitrator test this. In a room with Delano's counsel pushing back on every line. Under the binding arbitration clause your agreement requires. Private confidence isn't the same as public proof. Not yet. She closed the folder slowly, tapping it once with 2 fingers like she was sealing something shut. And there's something else, she added, quieter now. A challenge this week won't satisfy a man like Delano Lattimore. If he can't win this in arbitration, Clemmy, he'll look for softer ground to push on instead. Your crew, your reputation in this town, people who work for you and depend on that paycheck every week. Roosevelt Kinlaw had worked for me for 18 years, since he was 23 years old, and green enough to nearly drop a load-bearing beam on his own foot. And in all that time, I'd never once seen him show up at the equipment yard on a Sunday afternoon, looking the way he looked that day. I was walking the lot, doing what I always did when my mind needed quieting, checking equipment nobody had asked me to check, when I spotted him leaning against his truck near the gate, arms crossed, waiting. "Miss Clemmy," he said, straightening up when I got close. "Got a minute?" "Always do for you, Roosevelt." "What's on your mind?" He shifted his weight, looked out over the rows of parked equipment instead of at me, the way men do when they're working up to something uncomfortable. "There's talk going around. Some of the crew heard things about the company, about you and Mark, about who's really running things these days. Wanted to hear it from you straight instead of secondhand." I appreciated him for that, for driving out on a Sunday instead of letting rumor do its slow damage through a job site over weeks. "What exactly are they saying?" "That Mark's out. That there's some kind of family fight tearing the business apart. Couple of the younger guys are nervous about their paychecks, Miss Clemmy. Nervous enough that one of them's already put feelers out with a competitor over in Murfreesboro." I felt that land the way bad news about my crew always did, personal and immediate, because these were men with mortgages and children and car payments who trusted their livelihoods to decisions I made. "Then let me put it to you plainly, so you can carry it back to whoever needs to hear it. I own 60% of this company. I built it from one truck, Roosevelt, same as you remember. Nothing about payroll, about job assignments, about this company's ability to pay every single person on that crew has changed one bit. I am not going anywhere. And neither is this business." Something in his shoulders eased, visibly, like he'd been carrying that tension the whole drive out. "That's what I figured. But I needed to hear you say it. You know how men talk when they're scared for their families. Fear makes rumors grow faster than truth can catch up to them." "Tell them the truth caught up," I said. "Tell them I'm standing right here, same as I've stood every Monday morning for 31 years, and I intend to keep standing here a good while longer." He nodded, some of the worry finally leaving his face, and turned like he was ready to head back to his truck. Then he paused, glanced back at me with something more careful in his expression. "Miss Clemmy, can I say something else? Might not be my place." "Say it." "Mark hasn't been on a single job site in near 3 weeks now. Used to be out here checking on crews personal, you know that. Lately, word is he's been spending most his time over at some office downtown, meeting with Deja's father regular. One of the boys saw his truck parked there 4 times just this past week." I stood still in the middle of that equipment yard, the wind picking up dust around our feet, and felt something cold settle low in my stomach that had nothing to do with rumors about payroll at all. Deja showed up at my door again on a Wednesday evening, and this time there was no hesitation in her, no purse strap gripped white-knuckled in her hands. She stood on my porch steady, eyes red, but dry. And I knew before she said a word that something inside her had finally broken loose. "Can I come in?" she asked. "I need to tell you everything. All of it. This time." I stepped aside and let her into my living room, and she sat down across from me, back straight, hands folded in her lap like she'd rehearsed this on the drive over. "I went to see my father yesterday," she said. "Told him I was done not knowing what he'd actually done. Done letting him keep me in the dark the same way he's kept everyone else in the dark. So I asked him straight out. And for once, he didn't dance around it. I stayed quiet, the way I always did when I wanted the whole truth instead of a careful version of it. He told me everything," she continued. "Said Priest and Sons was undervalued, debt-free, sitting on land worth more than anyone realized, and all of it resting on one aging woman's personal signature. His words, not mine." She winced slightly saying it, like the phrase tasted bad in her mouth now. "He said Mark was, his word again, moldable. Said if he could help arrange financing that replaced your guarantee, quietly, after the wedding settled, Mark would owe him enough goodwill to bring him in as an advisor, maybe a minority stake eventually. He said it like it was just smart business." "And the wedding," I said. "Was that ever about anything else?" Deja's jaw tightened. "He wanted it small and private so nobody outside his own circle would ask questions too early. He didn't want you meeting people, asking things, connecting dots before the financing was already in motion. He said, and I remember this exactly, the longer she stays outside of it, the easier this becomes." Hearing it stated so plainly, so coldly, didn't hurt the way I expected. It settled something instead, the last piece of a puzzle sliding into place after weeks of half-answers. "I told him it was wrong," Deja said, her voice shaking now, but not breaking. "I told him you didn't deserve to be maneuvered around like an obstacle in your own son's life, and he looked at me like I was naive for saying so. Told me business doesn't leave room for sentiment. I told him maybe that's exactly why he's about to lose both a son-in-law's trust and a daughter's respect in the same year." I reached across and covered her hand with mine, the first time I'd touched her since she'd walked into my house that very first evening. "That took something. Telling me this?" "It's not enough," she said, shaking her head. "I know that. But I called Mark before I came here. Told him everything. The same way I just told you. Told him he has to decide, right now, whether he's fighting for this marriage and rebuilding something honest with you, or whether he's going to keep letting my father fight battles that were never really his to fight in the first place." "What did he say?" Deja's eyes filled again, but her voice stayed steady. "He didn't say anything at first. Just went quiet on the phone, the way he does when he doesn't want to face something. I told him I wasn't hanging up until he answered me honestly for once. I told him this is the last time I'm asking." The arbitration room sat on the 9th floor of a downtown office building, all glass and gray carpet. A long table down the center with water glasses nobody would touch, and an arbitrator named Mrs. Ashworth sitting at the head like a judge who'd already read every page twice before we walked in. I sat beside Faye, my hands folded calm on the table, wearing the same navy blouse I'd worn to the vote itself because some part of me wanted that continuity, wanted to remind myself I was the same woman who'd sat in that conference room weeks ago and said one clear word. Mark sat across from us beside a man I'd never met. Sharp suit, sharper voice, introduced as representing Ashcombe and Reed. Mark wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "We're here," Mrs. Ashworth began, "to review the validity of a member vote removing Mark Broughton as managing member of Priest and Sons Construction, LLC, under the binding arbitration clause of the operating agreement. Counsel for Mr. Broughton has submitted a challenge alleging improper notice. Let's begin there." Delano's attorney opened a leather folder with theatrical precision. Our position is straightforward. Article 9 of the operating agreement requires proper notice for any special member meeting, resulting in removal of managing authority. We believe the notice period in question may not have been fully satisfied, and we're asking this panel to void the vote on those grounds. Faye didn't flinch. She slid a folder across the table, thin, organized, nothing extra in it. Exhibit 1, certified mail receipt, dated April 14th. Exhibit 2, signed delivery confirmation, dated April 17th. Signature belonging to Mark Broughton himself. She let that sit a beat. That satisfies the required 30-day window before the meeting date of May 17th, with room to spare. I'd invite counsel to check his own client's signature against Exhibit 2. The attorney studied the page, jaw tightening slightly, the first crack in his composure. Exhibit 3, Faye continued, unbothered. Meeting minutes certified by a licensed court reporter. Quorum satisfied under Article 7 of the operating agreement by Mrs. Broughton's 60% membership interest alone, independent of any other member's attendance. She looked up. Every requirement was met. Every date lines up. I'd be happy to walk through each page individually if counsel needs more time. Mrs. Ashworth studied the documents herself, silence stretching long enough that I could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. "Mr. Broughton," she said finally, turning to Mark directly, "did you receive this notice on April 17th, as the signature suggests?" Mark's throat worked before he answered. "Yes." "And did you choose not to attend the meeting on May 17th? He glanced at me, just briefly, something raw moving behind his eyes. "Yes. I chose not to go." Delano's attorney tried once more, some argument about intent, about family circumstances clouding proper process, but Mrs. Ashworth raised a hand before he finished the sentence. "Counsel, I've reviewed the documentation myself prior to this hearing. It's thorough, properly dated, and procedurally sound. I find no grounds to void the vote." She closed her folder with a quiet finality that landed heavier than any raised voice could have. "My ruling is binding under the operating agreement's arbitration clause. The removal stands." The room went still. Mark's shoulders dropped, not in anger this time, but something closer to defeat, finally settling into acceptance. "Mr. Broughton retains his 40% ownership interest," Mrs. Ashworth continued, "but has no managing authority within the company going forward, absent future action by the majority member." She looked between us both. "What happens next, in terms of Mr. Broughton's role or future involvement, is a matter for the two of you to determine outside this room." Delano's attorney began gathering his papers, defeat written plainly across his movements. Mark just sat there, staring at the table, at his own signature on that delivery confirmation, at the exact moment 30 days ago had cost him everything he thought he'd secured. He looked up at me finally, something different in his face than I'd seen since this whole thing began. "Mama," he said quietly, "what happens now?" Mark came to my house alone this time. No mud on his boots, no lawyer's letter in his hand, just himself, standing on my porch in the kind of stillness I hadn't seen from him since he was a boy waiting to confess something he already knew would disappoint me. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Really talk. Not defend, not explain. Just talk." I let him in, and we sat at the same kitchen table where I'd once spread 31 years of paperwork across the surface, where he'd once stood with mud on his cuffs demanding answers I wasn't ready to give him back then. "I've been sitting with everything since the mediation," he said, hands wrapped around a glass of water he wasn't drinking. "Deja told me everything her father said. About the wedding, about the timing, about all of it being calculated from the start." He looked up at me, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't see defensiveness in his eyes. "I let him use me, Mama. I told myself I was just staying out of grown folks' business, letting him handle banking things I didn't understand. But the truth is, I didn't ask hard questions because the answers were convenient. Easier to let him worry about the company than to sit with the fact that I was helping him push you out of something you built with your own hands. I didn't say anything yet. I wanted to hear the rest of it. Wanted to know if this apology had bottom to it, or if it would slide sideways into an excuse the way every conversation before had. The wedding, he continued, voice rougher now. That's the part I can't forgive myself for. Not the small ceremony. The 2 weeks after. I could have called you the very next morning. I chose not to, because some part of me was scared of how you'd look at me once you understood how deep I'd let him in. That's on me, not Deja, not even really Delano. Me. That's the first time you've said that without a single but attached to it, I said quietly. Because there isn't one, Mark said. I'm not here to explain myself out of what I did. I'm here because I don't want to lose you the way I almost did. And I don't want to keep building a life with Deja standing on a foundation her own father tried to poison. Deja, who'd been waiting in the car, appeared at my screen door then, hesitant, waiting for a nod from me before stepping inside. She sat beside Mark, close, her hand finding his on the table without him having to ask for it. I told my father I won't be attending his Sunday dinners for a while, she said. Told him if he wants a relationship with me, it starts with respecting the family I actually chose, not managing it from the outside. She looked at Mark, something steady passing between them. We're building something separate from him now, whatever that costs. I sat back in my chair, looking at the two of them, feeling something in my chest shift for the first time in weeks, not fully healed, but no longer entirely closed either. I know I don't have any right to ask this, Mark said, his voice dropping lower, more vulnerable than I'd heard it in years. But Mama, is there still a place for me in that company? The one I grew up in? The one I used to ride in the passenger seat of your truck to job sites before I could even see over the dashboard? I looked at my son for a long moment, weighing 31 years against the last 2 months, love against the discipline it had taken to survive them both. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit a while longer before I answered him, not out of cruelty, but because some questions deserve the weight of real consideration instead of a quick, comfortable yes. There's a place, I finally said, but it won't look like the one you left. Mark's shoulders eased slightly, though he didn't relax fully, and I could tell he understood there was more coming. You'll come back as a project manager, not a managing member. Under my authority, answering to me the way any employee would, same as anyone else on that crew. If you want your name back on contracts, on decisions, on the direction of that company, you'll earn it the same way I did. Slow, documented, proven, not assumed. I held his gaze steady. No shortcuts because you're my son. No handshake deals because I love you. Everything in writing, everything reviewed by Faye, same as it should have been from the start. That's fair, Mark said quietly, and I watched something settle into him. Not defeat this time, but the particular relief of a man finally standing on solid ground he understood the shape of. And Delano doesn't set foot near this business again, I added. Not as an advisor, not as a favor, not as anything. That door is closed permanently, and I need to hear you say you understand why. I understand, Mark said, no hesitation in it now. I should have understood it a long time before this. Deja reached over and squeezed his hand, and something in her face told me she'd already made her own peace with that boundary. Maybe before he had. I called Faye that same week, and true to her word, she drew up new terms, clear and specific. The kind of paperwork that protects everyone involved instead of quietly assuming the best of people who hadn't yet earned it. Mark signed every page without complaint, reading each clause carefully this time, the way a man reads something he finally understands the cost of ignoring. Tanisha came by the following Sunday with a peach cobbler she hadn't been asked to bring, and we sat on my porch the way we had 100 times before, watching the evening settle gold over the yard. "You did good, Clemmy," she said, watching Mark's truck pull out toward a job site he was, for the first time in his life, driving to as an employee rather than an owner, walking in assuming his place. Not everybody could have held that line and still let him back in the door. "I didn't do it for him," I said. "Not entirely. I did it because I spent 31 years building something out of nothing, and I wasn't about to let it collapse into ruin just to prove a point I'd already made." Faye stopped by that evening too, folder in hand, the last of the paperwork officially filed with the state. And the three of us sat together as the sun dropped low behind the equipment yard I'd once mortgaged my whole life to secure. I thought about that photograph again, the one still tucked in my fireproof box, a younger version of myself standing crooked next to a flatbed truck in boots 2 sizes too big, certain of nothing except that I refused to disappear inside somebody else's plans for my life. Nobody gets to decide who's important in my own story. Not a son who forgot to ask the right questions. Not a man who mistook my patience for weakness. Not anybody who ever thought quiet meant powerless. I built every inch of what I have with my own 2 hands, and I intend to be seen standing in the middle of it for every year I have left.